Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage writer, producer, director Patrick Daly and associate producer Michael Daly, also director's brother.
Hello. Thank you so much. Thank you. And I know it's very late and there's been a lot of movies today and there's been a lot of subtitles today, so you're brave to watch through all these, and we really appreciate you coming and also staying for a little discussion afterwards. You go.
Okay.
I'll just answer.
If anyone wants to come, if you want to come down closer, feel free to come down closer. We'll wait to ask more questions. What'd you think of the movie? Wasn't it?
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, as I always say, I'm sure there'll be lots of comments you want to make, a lot of compliments you want to give, but let's, for this time, let's just ask questions. And so with that, do we have any questions? Yes, sir.
How did you get the idea for the story?
So the question is, where did the idea for the story come from?
It came from two things. The initial idea actually comes from our mother. She emigrated to the States in the 60s as a domestic worker. So she came out of post-war Europe from a very poor family in Scotland. Her parents died when she was very young, and so she was brought in when she was in her early 20s to work for a family in New York. And so that was kind of part of our childhood narrative. And so we kind of got to see what that was like in, a couple decades ago, but the idea of being far from home, away from the family. I mean, she went almost 30 years before she saw her family again. So that was something, as a young person, it was kind of in the back of my mind, but you kind of forget about it then. But when I moved to Singapore, I live in Singapore. I moved there about 10 years ago. All of a sudden, domestic workers were everywhere. Now in New York, as you probably are aware, it does happen, but it's usually reserved to a much smaller group of people. In Asia, the idea of having domestic help is very common. All throughout Asia, it's a very standard sort of middle class sort of thing to do. Everyone has, whether it's India, the Philippines, Singapore, it's very common. And so I would see all these women kind of around, and as I was kind of watching them and seeing what their lives are like, I kind of sort of mapped that back to kind of what my mother's life would have been like. And especially, I mean, we didn't show it so much here, but for many of the women, so working as migrant workers, their lives are very, very tough. It's very abusive. They go through all sorts of really horrific experiences. And so it had kind of a personal resonance with me. But I didn't really want to make a film about abuse. I didn't want to really focus on that. I didn't want to make a film about labor. I wanted to make a film about women who are dealing with very difficult professional circumstances. And so when we started researching the film, we spent about 2 years doing I'm an anthropologist by training, so I'm a university professor in the day job. And so we spent about 2 years doing research on the migrant worker communities in the Philippines, but mainly the sort of Filipinas, Indians, and Indonesians, and also the men from Bangladesh who are the construction workers, to kind of see what their lives are like. And we initially thought maybe we'd do a documentary, but it was quite gripping material. And what we really focused on was, how they try to carve out their own little lives in the midst of trying to deal with difficult employers, but also very difficult families. Because one of the things that we found that was very common is the abuse that these women face comes from different fronts, right? It's not just sort of, I go away from home and my employers are really horrible. For many of the women, their families are quite horrible as well. They deal with all sorts of abuse at home, whether it's from their husband, whether it's from very ungrateful and demanding sort of relatives who want money. And so that kind of became the genesis of the story. And so we kind of mapped out, spent 2 years kind of researching. And then when we decided to actually shoot it, once my partner Joel Fendelman and I, once we kind of wrote a script that we thought kind of had a narrative arc, had a full story, we spent about 6 months workshopping scene by scene with groups of migrant workers. So there's 4 professional actors in the film. Everyone else are just mostly migrant workers. So almost every woman in the film is a domestic worker. And so we wanted to actually bring them really into the storytelling process. So both through casting them, but also through reworking the script with them. So with the group of women we casted, we went scene by scene and we had them adjust the writing so it matched their own reality. So that was a big part of the final thing you saw. It wasn't just me and Joel sitting there coming up with a story. We kind of mined deeply into their lives and put that on the screen. That was a big part of what we wanted to accomplish.
Kind of amazing, isn't it? Yes, ma'am. So the question is about the salary she was paid a month and how that would equate to
Yeah, it's not much. I mean, the standard working hour for migrant workers, 2 years ago in Singapore, where domestic workers are treated better in Singapore than many other places in Asia, just to give you some standards. So if you work in Dubai or Saudi Arabia, it's really, really tough. Singapore is the most enlightened place to be a domestic worker. And until 2 years ago, it was not required to give people days off. So typically, most women would go through the first 2-year contract without ever having a day off. That was it. The days typically start at 5 a.m. They usually go to about midnight. And now you have to have, it's recommended you give 1 day off a week. And that's usually about 3 or 4 hours on Sunday. Right? So the working hours are quite long. And the salary, it's probably about 400 US a month is what they're making. So that's what it makes in terms of full, plus room and board. But room and board is usually you have a little broom closet somewhere in the back where you stay. Or very commonly, you roll out a mat and sleep in the child's room. So in the family we portrayed here, this expat family is a little more affluent, so they have more space. But Singapore is quite a built-up city, and apartments are quite small generally. So it's very common that the maid just lives with the children. So that's kind of the fairly normal experience, but it's not a lot of money. But it matters back home. Right? So all the money that they earn, generally a big percentage is remitted. So most women keep less than probably $50 a month for themselves. So you see long lines out of these remittance sends every payday. So whenever people get paid, you have long queues, people to send the money back home. And that's very, very common.
And I think part of the question was, it may be hard to answer this because they're sending it back to many different countries.
Yeah.
But how far does that money go in the various countries they're sending it to? I don't know if you can answer that.
It's huge. I mean, when we talk about development aid, right, we talk about sort of overseas foreign aid, we talk about overseas foreign investment. Both of those combined pale when it comes in comparison to remittances. Remittances is the single biggest global driver of development and change in the world. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars a year sent from sort of immigrants who are sending. And sometimes they're higher end, but a lot of them are sort of very low-wage migrants. But huge amounts of money go back home, and this pays for everything. Setting up houses, paying tuition for schools to go to sort of, generally in places like Indonesia, in India, the sort of state schools may not be so good at a younger level. And so you got to try to put the kids through private school, for example. Everything. But part of the problem is it's a non-stop demand. So if you know someone, if someone in your family works overseas, there's constant requests for money. No matter how much you make, they think you're rich. You're overseas, mom or an aunt is overseas, and then every month there's demand and demand. So it does make a huge difference, but for the women themselves, it's the ones who work the hardest for it often benefit the least from it, is what we found. Right,
so the question has to do with what hopes do you have for the film in terms of how it has an impact on migrant workers?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a commercial project, let's put it that way. I mean, we did the whole thing on a very, very tiny budget, and we had a lot of people throwing in support because they liked the idea of the film. And the basic idea was to really think about education, outreach, and advocacy. So that was one of our primary motivations. So it's really great to share the film with audiences like this, which is nice, but our main audience were migrant workers and their families back in their homes. So our bigger audience will be in places like India, the Philippines, and these things. And what we're planning on doing is sort of expanding our once we finish the film festival route, we're going to expand our distribution. We're not going to do a conventional distribution. So we're looking to get various types of sponsorships so we can make it freely available and also dub it into some different languages, such as Hindi, sort of Indonesian, Tamil, some of the main languages of the places that export, and also Spanish, of course, migrant workers. And we've already started partnering with NGOs that deal with migrant workers' rights so they could sort of help us distribute the film. So the goal is to kind of get it out there, places like this, campuses like this, so people could watch the film and have discussions about the situation of these women and kind of see some of the nuances of what their lives are like. So that's kind of the main ambition of it.
So when you say that part of the goal is to show it to other migrant workers, and you've had some opportunities to do that,
yeah.
How has it been received by that community?
Well, I'm actually getting lots of comments on Facebook, messages saying, when are we going to get to see it? And so like they know it's kind of, we go to film festivals, but probably at the end of the summer, after the summer, we're going to kind of really scale that side of it up. In part, it's really kind of sad, but it limits our ability to be in festivals if it's distributed in other ways. So we kind of have to go through festivals first, and then we could do whatever we want with it. But we did do a screening for a big group of domestic workers in Singapore just to kind of test it out. So about 400 women show up, and all through one of the NGOs we worked for. So it was a bit of a thank you for helping us cast the film. And they really loved it. I mean, they really enjoyed it. And I don't really take much credit as a filmmaker for that. I think they were just really excited to see literally themselves, but most importantly, women like themselves on screen telling this story. And the woman who got her hair cut in the scene, in one of the scenes there, her employer, like when she said she was in this movie, she didn't really want her to be in the movie. And at some point she kind of told her, don't forget you're a maid. You're not a movie star, you're a maid. And so it became really important for us to be like, no, you're movie stars now. And we want that to be kind of pushed out there. And so that was something that was a big part of it. So we're hoping the film kind of goes out and plays very widely. And also, we're hoping families in places like the Philippines will watch this and hopefully critically reflect on what's going on. When they export their sort of mainly women overseas, they do it, there's kind of a narrative about what happens. The sort of the sacrificing mom who goes overseas for a few years and she works hard, but she's chaste and she's this and that. And the reality is most of the women from the Philippines who are migrant workers, or a big percentage, are coming out of bad situations. In the Philippines, divorce is not legal. So we talked to many women, this was their divorce. So this is a socially acceptable way to leave your husband or to do something different. And so we're hoping this opens up conversations in places like that about the conditions these women live through, and also so people could think about what they're asking from their sisters, their aunts, and their moms when they send them overseas.
Yes, more questions? Yes.
Yeah.
So the question is about whether or not these companies that were sending them over were also exploiting the workers, and was that a part of the theme of the film?
I mean, we wanted that to be part of it. And I think I think there's a bit of a myth about migrant work, especially in America. I've been outside the States for 20 years. I'm originally from the New York area, and I moved overseas. Now I come back sort of to visit family once a year. But there's been lots of conversation, especially recently, about the role of migrants, especially low-wage migrants or undocumented migrants within American society. And one of the things that most people don't seem to understand is that the poorest of poor almost never migrate. Migration is almost exclusively for people several rungs up the socioeconomic ladder. And when you talk about, say, Syrian refugees migrating through Turkey into Europe, every time you cross the border, you're paying someone. It's usually never you just putting things in your bag and going across. It's always done through a wide range of brokers and agents, sometimes on legal, like what you see in a place like this, but often illegal. And so migration costs lots of money. And so people go often very deeply into debt for the opportunity to work. And that also puts lots of pressures on them when they're working, because then they're kind of trapped. So typically, if you have a 2-year contract to work as a migrant worker in Singapore, it's not till the end of your second year that you've paid off what you owed to get there. So you're not making any money for your first 2 years. So it's not until year 3 or 4 or 5 that you can actually start accumulating real money, or modest amounts of money. So we want to kind of shine a little light on that. I'd love it if it made a difference. I don't think it's going to. I think places like Singapore feel pretty self-assured. They like to tell themselves, oh, we're very good to our help, that sort of thing, which is a fairly standard line, I suspect. But we're hoping that these bring up some little issues there.
So to give your brother a chance to talk,
yes, please
what
do.
were some of the technical challenges in getting this film made there?
Locations in the Philippines were tough, but we just went out there. Me and another guy who's not here, Charlie, the other associate producer, and we just walked through neighborhoods, begged, pleaded, borrowed, and we got people to just, some of the locations were his in-laws' house because his wife is from the Philippines, but a lot of the stuff we had to go find like a hairdressing guy, and that was the guy who owned the place, and he was giving one of his workers a haircut just for the sake of filming that day, and he just said, "Come on in and film," and we're like, "Thank you, we needed that." And just finding locations in the Philippines, because we showed up with about 3 weeks to, we had about 3 weeks to find locations, cast up, and go. We had to find a doctor. No, the girl was pregnant, so we found a doctor that was willing to be filmed giving her the ultrasound. And what you're seeing on the screen is her finding out the sex of her baby. That really happened. And we just paid for the doctor. Like, we're going to pay you the doctor. You don't have to pay this one. And, it was just a real doctor's office. So that was 3 weeks of just, hey, guys, help us make a movie.
Yeah, I think,
Was that part of the story that the girl was going to be pregnant?
well, yeah, I mean, we asked sort of a whole bunch of women, because everything was, what do I know? I'm a white guy from New York, man. This isn't my world. I can't even pretend it's my world. I mean, we had tremendous amounts of support crafting the story and getting the nuance. And so we asked a lot of women, what would be a reason why you would go home? What's a plausible reason? And that was a very common thing. And I think also partly because one of the issues when women migrate especially it's very typical that men in those sort of exporting countries like the Philippines don't assume motherly responsibilities. Right? Women assume masculine roles, but men almost never assume feminine roles, quote unquote. So in the Philippines, the idea that the man is the pillar of the house and the mother is the spirit of the house, the light of the house. So in places like that, like mother goes away and there's a big vacuum and dad doesn't always fill it. And it often leads to kind of breakdown and decay within those families themselves. Who's watching the children? As the kids get older, who's taking care of them? So that is something we want to focus on. And to kind of build upon what Mike said, I mean, for the most part, we had a tiny budget, so almost everything we saw there, we would just show up with actors, which were mostly migrant workers, to a live situation and just plug them in and film. So like things like a beauty contest. There's a beauty contest going on. Can we make a movie out of this? Can we get 200 people to sign a sort of a release form? And then we had 2 hours to shoot it. And so most of the scenes in the film where it's in public spaces was done very much, a very guerrilla-style filmmaking, if you will.
Yeah, the question is, how did you decide on casting the main character to play Marie?
Well, from the onset, Joel and I were pretty convinced that we wanted to have most of our cast be migrant workers. That was a big part of the initial idea. We were not certain about the lead, both for creative reasons. It's a real big responsibility to carry a film. And for people who here who may or may not be filmmakers, if you're a filmmaker, you know your lead actor they have to pull it off. If they don't, the whole thing falls. And it's a big responsibility. But also, practically speaking, all of those women are still domestic workers in Singapore. And a lot of women couldn't get time off. So we had to schedule most of our shoots that involved migrant workers on Sundays during their days off. And we had to, Angela, her name is, we had to buy her out for 3 months. And her employer was very cooperative, very helpful. I had to meet with her a few times, convince her we were a legit thing. And then we had to hire a replacement sort of maid for our production times. But when we did the casting, we cast a number of we auditioned with a number of professional actresses from the Philippines. We're all very good. But at the end, there was 2 things. One, they just didn't feel the part. I mean, there's sort of a stoic world weariness that comes from having been a mother to 3 children, then working as a maid and doing these other things that it's really hard to fake that. Because it's in the look, it's in the eyes, it's in the hands, the physicality of what it's like to do manual work all the time. And a lot of the actresses in the Philippines were very beautiful, sort of soap opera looking kind of characters. None of them which you really said, oh, she's the maid, right? It didn't work really. But also we figured if she can carry it, it's great. If not, it's worth the shot because having sort of a maid as the lead actress, we thought really would make the film. And so we kind of rolled the dice a bit. And she turned out to be fantastic. And some of the credit will also go to our editor, John Hammond, who was very, very delicate with this. And when you're working with non-actors, a lot of it's about the editing. Like you're going through, because they're not always hitting things on the right mark. So it's actually really hard to cut it together. But he did a beautiful job kind of bringing out kind of the best parts of her and showing her in a very, very positive light. And so, yeah, she was amazing, really good about it. And, you know, it worked out really well.
Yeah, the question is about her employer who seemed affluent but had similar roots.
Yeah, that was kind of an interesting, most people don't, I'm not sure if everyone picks it up. We thought that was kind of an interesting little subline there, in part because it kind of flips the script a little bit on the more standard image of a kind of Caucasian expat with an Asian wife, for example, which is very common in places like Hong Kong and Singapore. We thought it was more interesting to have women kind of driving the film at all points. But also, as Mike mentioned, my wife, she's an academic. She's an anthropologist, and she studies global labor flows. And she's originally from the Philippines. So we had a lot of very hardcore PhD-holding Filipino feminists kind of helping us with the film. And at some point, we were kind of trying to incorporate their experience a bit. Right? The fact that there's many women who migrate, especially from Asia, non-Caucasian women who migrate, suffer all sorts of discrimination, irrespective of their qualifications. So you get lots of women in the finance and health and education who are sort of very well qualified, very well educated, and they get treated very poorly when they're abroad, right? And so we wanted to kind of show that side of it as well, that it's not just about sort of, you know, that's not just about sort of the women at the lower end. Women at the very high ends of the scale still deal with lots and lots of problems. In short, it's really tough to be a woman in the global market force, no matter where you're from, what color you are. We want to kind of show part of that in the film as well in a little way. I think the other thing, there's one scene I really like is when they have the little sort of argument in the kitchen. My favorite part about that is when she then washes the cup at the end. Because I wanted to also kind of add this layer that no matter what happens, there's still a separation. They're not friends. You're still the help. Because often within these more affluent circles, people like to kind of convince themselves, hey, we're pretty good employers. oh, they're kind of one of the family. It's a very standard line you hear from people who have domestic help. It's a way of kind of almost apologizing, but sort of excusing the fact that they have a live-in servant, which I've done as well. We had one of our aunts living with us when we had a child, and it was a really awkward experience. But I've never said she's one of the family, because she's not. I pay her, she's my employee. But this narrative that they're one of the family, I think, is very misrepresenting. And I think it sort of does a disservice to the women there. And it's a form of emotional blackmail in a way. Right? So we want to kind of show that line there as well and how they're positioned within the family.
I also noticed that you had her character of Marie seems to kind of blossom the longer she's there. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, and that was part of that. I mean, a big part of it is looking at this idea of kind of empowerment. Migration is a transformative experience, and it is. When people move abroad, especially coming from a fairly rural provincial area like where she came in the Philippines, going to a hyper-modern city like Singapore does change you. And assuming additional responsibilities, becoming the main breadwinner of their family, right? So that was an important part of it, to show this growing sense of empowerment throughout, both in terms of her own professional standing, her relationships with other people, her confidence. But in the end, we also wanted to kind of, we actually did research back in the Philippines. We said, okay, like the NGO she was part of, this class, that was a real class. We just kind of, we talked to them. It's an NGO in Singapore. We said, could we film around this? So the teacher there just kind of did a regular class, and we just filmed it. So that's kind of what they do on Sundays on their days off. But we actually kind of tracked down some women who went through this experience, who went through all the business training and how to manage money, and very low rates of them actually succeed when they go home. Statistically, it works, but it's not that successful. And the single biggest impediment is the reception they get back home. Right? They become different people when they go abroad. When they come back home, especially to very conservative areas, those changes are not always welcome. Right? And you saw that a bit with the husband there. This sense of empowerment is not well received in some circles. And so we wanted to show that stuff as well. And I thought that was kind of an interesting kind of thing toward the end there, showing it wasn't just sort of, oh, she got and everything worked out really well. No. The reality is it often doesn't. It's often very challenging even when they go back, in spite of their experiences abroad. In fact, most of the people we talked to who had been there for more than 10 years in Singapore basically say, I'd rather just stay here. Like, I can't really imagine going back to that. Because even though it's very difficult in places like Singapore, they value the little bit of freedom that they do have. So being able to kind of go out on their own. Like, my wife is very well educated. She comes from a traditional family. When we first got married, she would tell me obsessively when she was leaving the house. It was really annoying. I was like, why are you telling me where you're going? Just go. She's like, at some point she's like, I guess I'm not used to leaving the house without telling a male I'm leaving the house. When she was with her parents, she told her father. Every time she left, can I go to the shop? Can I do this? So these roles are deeply, deeply sort of inculcated into people. And that was something we wanted to show there as well.
Please be sure to turn in your ballots. Thank you to Patrick and Michael.